Hi, everybody. Susan Storm here from psychologyjunkie.com. And I am especially excited about today because I'm joined not only by my good friend Denzel Mensa, but also Richard Owen, who is someone I have admired for many years for his amazing work in the type field. Richard is a specialist, a Jungian specialist, but also an organizational psychologist. And he's going to be talking to us today about a little bit of his research on shadow functions. And if you've been watching it with us over the last few months, you know, me and Denzel have been talking about shadow functions for a while. And there's only so much that we can pull from books and research that we've seen out there. But Richard has done a lot of firsthand research. And so I'm really excited, Richard, to hear what you have today. Could you introduce anyone who's watching? Could you introduce them to yourself and just tell them a little bit about you?
Sure, yeah. I'm Richard Owen. I'm based in the UK. I live in Brighton on the south coast. My original career many years ago was in music, actually. A lot of people don't know that, but I had a career in music doing performing, sound engineering, and a whole range of other things as well. And I basically got into psychology and had a career change and retrained. So over 10 years ago now, I did my MSc in Organisational Psychology. I've gone on to do coach training and lots of psychometrics training, both type and trait instruments. So, you know, I'm not prejudiced towards or against anything, really. I'm just fascinated by personality. So I tend to absorb everything I can.
Thank you, Richard. Just one second. Sorry, I'm getting over a flu here. So if I occasionally cough, that's just why.
That's all right. Bless you. Take care. Take time.
So I did not know you had a background in music. That's really interesting. So you have INTJ preferences, correct?
That's right, yes.
That's right. And how did you figure out, like, what was your first introduction to type?
So I was in my music career at the time. So it was when I was 30 years old. And to put it in the context, I'm now nearly 47. It was about 17 years ago. So I built or created a recording studio in my parents' house, as you do, in what was my brother's old room. Now, my brother had gone on to become a solicitor, a lawyer, and I'd got a proper job, whereas I'd kind of had this crazy. And there's a type story to why I became a musician, just as an aside, because it was really my puer, third function, my introverted feeling, which when I was at university, that had kind of come into my consciousness and awareness, and I had to seek some deep meaning in whatever I did. It was really such a core thing for me that I had to find something to do as a job that I loved, and music was it. That was what it became. So I became this crazy puer on a mission for many years. But anyway, this point is I was in this recording studio, former brother's bedroom, and he'd been on various training courses at work and left a report, like basically Myers-Briggs book, like Intro to Type book, and in the cupboards. So I was clearing it out, and I found this. I was like, this is really interesting. Just sat there on the floor, and like, I don't know how long it was for, but my legs went numb. And by the time I'd got up, I'd figured out my preferences were INTJ. I'd figured out and absorbed the contents of the book. But that was the starting point. I went on to kind of verify that through actually taking many different instruments, going through many different trainings and all the rest of it. But that was the start. And it was interesting taking that point of never having had any contact with personality or type or anything for 30 years, but living my life and having that information, that history there to look back on. And then this framework, this model to put it into context. And like a lot of people with slightly less common types, I guess, it kind of made a lot of sense. You know, there wasn't anything else I'd found that really, or since that really makes sense of the reality of introverted intuition. You know, it's something that's not really even included in sort of the big five and other things. It's just kind of this mysterious kind of area of human behavior and activity that just seems to be otherwise unrecognized.
Thank you. It is. I feel like, especially for INTJs and INFJs, when they discover type, it's like all of a sudden their whole life makes sense, and all this confusion that they've had forever makes sense, because I feel like introverted intuitive types, and Denzel has ENFJ preferences. Like Denzel, do you feel similarly as an ENFJ? Like when you've discovered type, you're like, oh, now it all makes sense.
Yeah, it put a lot of language to things that I felt like I was already picking up archetypally. But then it also helped me to be able to communicate it to other people like extremely well. It's like, oh, this is yet another tool to be able to understand other people more, communicate with them more, and then also from there understand myself better, which might be different from you two as NTJs. I feel like NTJs maybe the more that you understand yourselves, and the better you understand other people. Whereas like for me, I feel like the reverse. It's like the more that I understand like humanity and people as a whole, then I'm like, wait a minute, I'm part of this. And so then it's like, I must have this too.
Yeah. And actually that makes me think I introduced myself and jumped right into interviewing Richard. But if you're joining us and you haven't met Denzel yet, he's usually on these live streams with me every week. And so I know we're kind of jumping back to the beginning here, but Denzel, can you quickly tell people just a little bit about yourself as well?
Yeah, again, for those of you who might not have already been following for the last few months, I'm Denzel Mensa. I'm an ENFJ. I'm a life, personal development, and relationship coach. And I have my own YouTube channel as well, where I talk about philosophical ideas and a lot of spiritual topics. Anything having to do with interpersonal dynamics, I'm all for it. And yeah, I think that's about it. I have coaching services that maybe we'll talk about more at the end, but you can find them at denzelmensa.com.
Thank you, Denzel. So Richard, this is really interesting. So you were in music and you said that was really an avenue for you to express your introverted feeling tertiary child function. And I think that's really interesting because I think a lot of people underestimate how much INTJs really need a good relationship with their introverted feeling and how important that is, especially as they hit their 30s, which is when, did you say that's when that sort of hit for you?
That's when I first learned about any personality models. So, I'd had a lot of life to look back on. And I also want to be clear that as well. What I mean, my type, I'm talking about underlying type in a lifetime context, not just a sort of snapshot of what I'm doing now, which is how a lot of people mistakenly see type, I think. It's that, really there was this really underlying pathway by which my mind was naturally drawn towards this introverted intuition and extroverted thinking process, the two processes that it just basically, that was just so clear looking in the whole of my teens, early 20s, like that just where my mind was going by default. So, that's what I mean when I'm recognizing my type. And, I don't think it is something that changes when you figure it out in that context, because it's just a fact, because you're looking back at the past and the past doesn't change, right? So.
Yeah. And it's great that you were able to find out so quickly and it just resonated so strongly that you were able to know and you didn't have a lot of questions about like, oh no, maybe I'm not the right type. I know everyone who watches me knows I've had my own issues settling on my type. So what got you interested in the shadow functions particularly? Because I know you've done a lot of research on that. What made you specifically interested in those?
Yeah, it's interesting using the word research. That makes it sound a bit more formal and systematic maybe than it is, But I've run a lot of workshops and mainly been applying it with myself and my own life and everyone I meet. Because the material that this model proposes, it's hidden in plain sight in the little details and interactions of everyday life, and in the everyday moments when your mind's wandering around and doing what it does, and you're trying to catch it at its activity. This is so it's a model of mindfully observing life, if your own and other people's. And how I got into it was, I guess about 10 years ago, through Bob McAlpine and John Beebe running workshops. At the time, I just attended that online, and it's just another level of understanding this stuff. I'd already been getting quite into Jung and going back to the roots of type, and I'd also, I guess it was maybe slightly after that, joined the board of the BAPT as well. Obviously done a lot with like their conferences and generally, trying to study type quite seriously. And so that's how I kind of, all that new information just got me really into this model. And again, Beebe's work just put such a radical proposal out there for human nature that I was like, it's just incredible. And I had to try and verify it for myself, because it's something that's so deep. I think that the only reason he realized it was because he spent hour after hour after hour with people in analysis, talking about their life, their experience, what's going on in their minds, and for over many years piecing this together. So I always wanted to do the same, and luckily I've been able to learn from John directly quite a lot, and even helped to promote his workshops and spent a lot of time talking with him as well. So and the shadow, who doesn't like the dark side, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's amazing that you have, working for BAPT, you have helped facilitate so many conferences involving so many people. And you've spoken at these conferences. And one thing that I really loved that you did was a breakdown of actually Russell Brand. I think you shared a video with me where you kind of dissected his personality type from the top all the way down to through the shadow, I think, or maybe it was just the shadow, but
it was the whole thing.
It was amazing. I was like, wow, it was such a clear picture of how the shadow functions can manifest. And I learned a lot from that. And I've learned a lot from you. And so that's one of the reasons I was so excited about having you here. I think it's so interesting, hearing what you've experienced and what you've learned. And so what do you think, how can you tell the difference between either yourself or someone else when they're operating in their egosyntonic state, so in our primary function? So if you're INTJ, that would be introverted intuition, extroverted thinking, introverted feeling, extroverted sensing. How can you tell the difference between someone who's operating in their egosyntonic state versus when they're operating in their shadow? What are some things that you've noticed, to be able to tell the difference either in yourself or somebody else?
And just to tag onto that, if it's not too much, I thought it was interesting how you said, who doesn't want to know about their dark side, right? And I don't know, how much sarcasm was in that, or if it was a real thing, because I could see it going both ways. But I've seen a lot of people who have been interested in learning more about their dark side, and then a lot of people who actually don't want to know anything about their dark side, and they definitely don't want you to be invited into that. So I'm also curious to know how you would define a dark side, because it's definitely you put dark side in any YouTube channel title and everybody's going to go see it, as long as it's not really talking about their own, maybe. Unless if it is talking about their own, then those are the people who they want to now combat it. Do I really associate with this? No, I don't, which might go back into what Susan's talking about, the ego dystonic and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm curious to also know I guess how would you define or describe a dark side, and why some might be interested, why some others might not be?
Yeah, good
but
point.
You can answer Susan's first.
Well, a quick caveat on it, in that, what we're starting to talk about is stuff that can often cross the line into pathology, into clinical stuff. And, although I totally believe this stuff, is manifest in everyday life, in just about everybody. If you get to know them well enough, and if you're going to live with someone or something like that, you'll start to see this stuff in everybody. But there's levels where often these parts of ourselves carry traumas and injuries, that from the past. And there's some great models, things like IFS, if you're familiar with that, internal family systems, where they work with parts, and there's burdened parts, and there's firefighters that really work very hard to try and keep those parts away from awareness, for good reason, because if they get out, they can be without the right support, there can be real problems. So we do have to be careful. And it's should everybody just go out and just go diving into the dark side? Not necessarily. It's a good point, Denzel, because you should be careful about this stuff. You should be aware if you start touching on things that are really distressing or get to levels of causing mental distress, you should seek the appropriate support. And don't forget, Jung was a psychiatrist. John Beebe is a psychiatrist and Jungian analyst as well. So you've got to know where the line between personal development and clinical support is, really. So be aware. And some people, not everyone should just go into it, but assuming we're on the okay side and we're not going to hit something that's too damaging for us, then yeah, maybe we should go into it. So the thing with ego, ego syntonic. So what was that whole question? Was that the whole question that you asked? That wasn't. That was an aside from me. The question.
I was just asking, how can you tell the difference in yourself or someone else? Like, what are some? I mean, obviously, we don't want to go around telling people, "Oh, you're operating in your shadow." You're operating in your shadow, and like pointing fingers or things like that. But what are some things you've noticed in your research, or like clues that either you or someone else is operating from their shadow rather than from their preferred functions?
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, people are not themselves. They're different to how you might normally know them as their best self, perhaps, or the everyday persona, right? They're basically, there's something qualitatively distinctly different about the state that they're in. And I do believe, like all personality and type as well, is a state model. It's a model about moments, when we're quite different in different moments. But a moment when, the shadow aspects of ourselves are in the forefront, you're going to be qualitatively different, and in a particular way that there might be a lot of emotional energy involved. There's going to be a sense that the person's kind of hijacked, gripped, running on a sort of autopilot in a way that there's something taking them over. These are old ancient things about, spirit possessions and things. We're basically just describing these exact kind of things, often on a more extreme level, but on a day-to-day basis, we all kind of know what we're talking about. We get kind of carried away, we're taken over. So there's those aspects, and then particularly the ego syntonic thing. It's like, well, we've got to ask, well, what is the ego, and what does syntonic mean, right? So I think the ego in Jungian sense, it's that center which of consciousness, or right. So anything that is like kind of known to the ego is conscious. That's kind of that's the point of it, is that it's that center. And if something's related to that center, then it is conscious. So it's the sort of center of reflexive awareness of like being aware of being aware. But also Jung talks about the will as well. Like, so it's that center of ourselves that feels it has agency or will, or free will, or even if free will is an illusion, it feels that it has that, or some sense of acting on the world. It's us doing. It's like the human doing, like that sense of. So there's the reflective aspect, and there's the reflexive and will and agency aspects of the ego. That's why I see it. There's two distinct things there, because you can be aware. They can be distinct, so that you can be aware that something's happening, but feel like you didn't make it happen, and it's not. You actually didn't want it to happen. It was just happening through you. Like, and that's the point of the other complexes or centers, we could call them, that sort of do grip us and take us over. And then the ego part is going, whoa, what's going on? This thing's, sometimes you're not even aware at all that's happening. You're just sleepwalking through it. But then when you are, you're like, oh God, I'm doing this thing. But I didn't make this happen.
Yeah. Oh, I'm not trying to interrupt. I'm just. So would you say it's? Oh, sorry. It's the Zoom curse where. Yeah. So would you say it's like when someone is on kind of a negative autopilot almost? It's like they're not in his full conscious control of everything they're doing. It feels almost like, when you're in a dream and you're like out of body and you're like, why am I doing that? Would you say there's an element of that too when you're in your shadow?
You might recognize that. Let's go back to the word negative, because that's quite interesting. I've had some people really don't like that word and are using it, in a sense. It's not negative per se, but it's negative like relative to, and we'll talk about the ego syntonic thing again, relative to the values or principles of the ego. I think that's the whole point. What principles? Let's talk about the ego. Essentially, is how, let's say, at least the Western world has come to exist, right? It's an egocentric world, whereby our world is lived by this sense of agentic self, and that all these other aspects are kind of assumed not to exist. There is only the agent, the human agent, acting on the world, out to get something or make something happen. And those the greatest principles by which this world works, it's growth. That's the metric that everyone keeps coming back to. It's like, No, it like as measure of success in the world, in this ego-driven world, is growth. So that tells us something about the nature of what it means to be ego-syntonic, that something about growth and construction and building and moving towards making something is inherent to the principles of the ego. And therefore, when something's syntonic with that, it's in tune with that, and therefore it's like got that kind of constructive vibe to it. And therefore the opposite of that is ego dystonic. Well, it's like not necessarily negative, but destructive. And if you think about nature overall, destruction is part of nature. You know, we're born, we grow, but we also wither and die, right? That's just part of the cycle of nature. But our ego-driven society loves life and growth and birth and seems to hate and abhor and be a bit scared and taboo about death, naturally. But, you know, all nature does this, these cycles. And so for me, like the shadow is just part of that aspect of nature, whereby it's that destruction. It's the yin part, if you look at the sort of yin and yang, like ancient Chinese model.
Yeah. So so would you say, like, and it's an important part. It's not just, I mean, it can produce negative things, but we need all the part, you know, we need the ego dystonic functions, we need the ego, and we need the ego syntonic functions. But I know one example I heard, and I can't remember if it was John Beebe who explained it this way, or if it was Mark Hunziker, who wrote the depth typology book. I think you read that one too. He said something about like the ego is like you're in a clearing in the woods or something, and it's like what you can see around you and what you can sense with your, you know, have certain conscious control over, but the shadow is more like what you can't see and necessarily control until you've individuated it in some, or identified it in some way. And then I've also heard that it can be very like reactive and defensive. Like when you react to something, you're like very strongly, and then later you're like, wow, that was a really dumb reaction. Or maybe I don't think I was myself when I reacted. And would you say that there's like a common feeling when someone's in their shadow of not quite being themselves? Like, wait, I don't know why I did that. Like, I'm not quite myself. And would you say that that's kind of been your experience with that?
Yeah, there can be quite a lot of integration needed after you've had an outburst or a grip experience. But remember, it's not just the shadow functions that can grip us. You know, the inferior functions, obviously famous for that. But I just do think, you know, the inferior function, it's just a bit useless, and like, you know, it's not evil. It's just useless, and then we struggle with it and we're frustrated with it, and it's just. But there's something destructive, and again, I'm steering away from the word negative, because like. It's a hard thing to do. If you can see the positive side of death and war and destruction and everything that human society would generally call evil, then you've got some of the way to understanding the shadow, and it's not being negative. But you've got to look in a really big picture way to really get around that.
That is I feel like I need to go like think about that for about an hour now.
Right.
What are your thoughts, Denzel? Do you have any questions about, you know, what are you thinking when you're hearing this? Because I know it's something you're also interested in.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me because, you know, thinking of, I've been studying and then also doing a lot of shadow work in general. Granted, I know that Jung said that shadow work really doesn't start until like after midlife. And I just turned 29. So I'm like, okay, you know, if anything, I'm probably just doing like pre-work so that way, when it comes to the time of like when like actual shadow work content is coming up, then it's like, okay, this won't be like new to me. Like I know how to not get behind in it. So that aspect of already like keeping up with integrating my shadow as it pops up. But then also, you know, looking at the different shadow functions, especially as an ENFJ, and even looking at, you know, types who have my shadow functions like INFPs, and my relationship with a lot of INFPs, and being able to like see myself in them, and, you know, maybe even like some triggers that I might have, some ways that I might trigger them, things of that nature. All that is like really appealing and like fascinating to me. And so when it does come to like kind of like what we were talking about earlier, you know, when it comes to like peering into the dark side and like your shadow in that way, it's I can definitely see more now than ever how much that is necessary to really understand the whole. And I like what you said about like the yin and yang concept, because you can literally, when you watch like a lot of anime, for example, a lot of these heroes that we're seeing, they're fighting against, evil and all of these things. It's very like dualistic nature, but you literally cannot have the heroes unless if you have evil there. And so you can't have light unless if you have darkness, and these things that you're distinguishing it. And so even with the ego, it's like you can't really have the ego, and correct me if I'm wrong, unless if you have like the shadow. And it makes sense why we have an aspect of ourselves that we're like associating with, like, yeah, this is who I am, this is what I feel and I identify with, because then by having that, you are now rejecting aspects of you that you don't identify with. And many might say like, well, many of those things that you're rejecting like outright, yeah, maybe some of them aren't really aspects that are part of you, but the ones that are especially like triggering to you, maybe that's actually because that's part of the shadow that you're suppressing, that you don't want to like get into. And until you learn to integrate that full side of it, you won't actually be able to arrive at the whole self. And without having that whole self, well, then you're really just a part of the self. And so all of that to say that I fully agree with what Richard said about the shadow being a very important aspect. And that's something that I've been constantly or like continuing to learn more and more and try to like disclose. Like the shadow is not something that necessarily needs to be like worshipped in a way, or you shouldn't allow your shadow to take over you either. But I feel like I would love to hear what Richard has to say about this. I told a friend recently, so I'm trying to find out how to say it without like being offensive, but she's a Christian, and she has certain habits or like tendencies that she seems to always fall to. And she's a sexual two in the Enneagram system, if we're familiar with that at all. And she's and ESFP. And so with that, then we like there's like certain behaviors that she might like see that she's always like fighting, and it's part of like her shadow aspects. And when we discuss these things, then she essentially has said that like it's very hard to like suppress those parts of her in a way, and then when it does come out, then the times when it does come out, then it just consumes everything. And what came to mind in that moment that I told her was that, well, yeah, that's because it's starved for so long that once it comes out to eat, then even though the ego has the food already, like, that it's supposed to eat and everything, like say, for example, if they're like two dogs and they each have their separate bowls of food and water and everything like that, the ego gets to eat every day, daily, like three times, like 3 meals a day kind of thing. But the shadow sometimes goes months without even getting to eat at all. So it's starving by the time that it's out. It comes out. Of course, it's not going to only eat the food that you've now put out there for that day. It's going to run over to the ego and it's going to eat everything that the ego has over there too. And it's going to act up each time because it's acting from a scarcity mindset of like, well, like I don't know the next time I'm gonna eat again, so yeah, I'm gonna tear everything up. Yeah, I'm gonna keep from starving myself. I'm gonna like inhale all the food that I can get because I do not know when my host is gonna feed me again. But and like maybe like we try to like starve or kill out that shadow aspect of us by starving it in that way, but it's never going to actually die. And I believe that Jung even said this, like we're not supposed to be killing the shadow, we're supposed to be integrating it. So what I told this friend was that, well, I think what you need to do is start finding healthier ways to feed your shadow so that when it does come out, it's not trying to steal food from the ego. It's not trying to take over the show. It's not acting from a scarcity mindset. You have it more on a leash. You have it more in control. You have to find out, okay, the root of like, what does this actually want? Maybe it's attacking human beings, but really it just wants some chicken. Like, and so you should cut this up, and like, help it to be able to actually devour things on a daily basis, so that now you won't feel like it's completely taking over you and it's destroying your whole life in some way.
Okay,
and
so
you can allow it to, coincide. But yeah, I want to know what your thoughts are on that.
Okay, so what's the one thing, like if in that analogy, like the food is attention, or like basically airtime, for it having its input into your life, then we've got the compensation sort of theory, that's central to Jung's ideas, that the more you push something down, the more it tries to push up. It's like that kind of balloon in the water effect, where it's like it's pushing back. So you're right, if you starve it of attention and don't let it get any airtime, then yes, it's gonna want to push back harder and harder until eventually it will explode out. That's the kind of theory here. So how do you kind of give it recognition in your life in a positive way? You've alluded to something else there as well, about the idea of like projection. You deny that it's you at all, and then you put it onto other people. That's another way, Susan, you'd recognize people being in their shadow, perhaps, is that they're ranting on about the evils in the world of what these people are doing and those things, and actually it's in them. That's the irony of it.
Yeah, so it's be like the root of a lot of hypocrisy, I would imagine.
Yeah, and you see it. I mean, the social media is the gateway to the dark side. I think it really opens it up, because this anonymity, and it somehow seems to take off the suppression of like their ego being able to hold back the flood, and it just, as you see, it just comes out, and people say all kinds of things they wouldn't say to another human being.
That is a really interesting way to consider it. I've never thought about that, about how like YouTube comments or blog comments or even the little battles people get into on Twitter, how that could be like a demonstration of people's shadows kind of at war with each other in different ways. Is that what you're saying? Like you're seeing a lot of that through there.
You see a lot of that kind of destructive, like triggered sort of behavior, like people like getting in a grip and going off on one.
Yeah, absolutely. That is so interesting. And I mean, I see that. I definitely see that, like in my, I post on my blog several times a week, and there's always angry emails or comments that are really violent in nature compared to what you're writing. For example, like I wrote an article that's like, here's what you'd be like as Santa Claus based on your personality type. It's a very like clearly not a serious, mind-boggling article on type, just like something fun and entertaining. Yeah. And you get an email back that's like, I hope you die. And you're just like, wow, okay, that seems like a strong response to something funny. But and Denzel, I know you do YouTube, you probably get lots of weird comments as well. I never thought of that being like an example of the shadow. So that's really interesting. And thank you for sharing that, because I think you've given me a lot to think about as well. How would you say, like in your, the research that you have done, I know like at one point you were gathering people and kind of interviewing like groups of people and getting information. I thought it was so interesting. I got the honor of being part of your panel, like the people you were interviewing at one point. What did you find out? What are some interesting insights? We're not going to go into each and every individual shadow function, because I know it's late in the UK and I'm not trying to take too much of your time. But what are some interesting insights that you had about the shadow as you were, conducting this research?
Yes. So I did groups where I had like say 5 or 6 of one particular type of the 16 types. I got through all of the intuitive types, and then with having children and other things, like life got in the way, and I never got onto the sensing types. But I learned a lot, because there's a lot of crossover between the positions in the different types. But yeah, there's 64 combinations if you think about it, like the 8 functions and the 8 archetypes. So there's quite a lot to cover. But things that I learned, I mean, the overall nature of the four shadow centers, I'll call them, because like archetypes, like this is one of the differences between when I'm using like what I'm calling personality parts, and that is a model. I've just used that as a name to basically describe my take on things. It's based on like a majority of like BB's ideas and work and Jung, but also me going back and reinterpreting type, also me wanting to reinterpret type in terms of modern psychology, and ultimately to do a PhD and to try and reintegrate the whole thing back into terms that will be understood in modern academic sense. But yeah, the things that I learn, the nature of these four centers, I'm not using the word archetype because they have archetypal qualities, let's call it, qualities that have been, let's say, timeless and universal between all people, that have been constantly recognized and portrayed in all like media and film and art and poetry over the ages. And those are the opposing. Well, the opposing personality is one that BB himself named. The critical parent, which is like an ancient archetypal form. The trickster, which is probably, I think, the most common one everywhere. There's not a single culture ever that's not had trickster characters in its stories. And then the demon, obviously the demon, like central part of like religion and Christianity and things like that, but also other mythologies as well. So they're the four, and I think this sort of nature of those, what they are, I see them, as kind of centers of the mind, centers of attention and agency, of their own agency. And as far as the ego is concerned, as the observing, reflexive sense of self, they are like separate agencies, because we feel them intruding and like almost like separate personalities. They are parts with their own personality, essentially, that I think are concurrently existing with the ego all the time. But then the ego kind of thinks it is all there is, and it is the only center. But I see them as very much equal centers to the ego. It's just that we've evolved as human beings to get into a state where we've become egocentric. That is what we see as the only center, and then we get surprised when these other ones bust in on the scene. But the nature of what they are, they qualitatively are distinct in the way that I think they interact with people. So, the opposing personality, that has got, I think BB describes it, has it having a very passive aggressive sort of destructiveness. And these parts of us come out in a very conflictual sort of way. They really, we really do come up against people with them, become antagonistic, and that. But the core of that opposing personality, I think, is that I see it as a bit of a saboteur, in that when that center is like basically constellating a functional aspect, then it presents it in a way that gives you like the very opposite of what you would want. It kind of torments you with it. So, and that can differ depending on whether it's like a perceiving function or a judging function. So with a perceiving function, it'll essentially show you the things you really wouldn't want to see or perceive.
Yeah.
It torment you with them almost. It's like, it's picking on the worst aspects it could perceive, from your ego's point of view. It's dystonic with that, and the judging ones, they come out with values and decisions that are like the opposite of what you would really want. So we give you some examples. Like for me, the extroverted intuition as an opposing function. I mean that phenomenology experience of in the state moment extroverted intuition. People will recognize that as almost like a daydreaming, imagining scenarios, like running through imagined situations and in their mind, that kind of film strip in the mind sort of daydreaming scenario. But when you get gripped in and carried away into it with the opposing personality running the show with it, it's like you start going off into some pretty dark, like imaginal scenarios where you kind of go. I imagined it when I was on a tube train in London. This is when I actually became aware of it for the first time. And on becoming aware of it, I suddenly went, oh God, I've been doing this all my life. But when I'm in it, and I didn't have the handle on it to see it. But often I'd been drifting off in this state, so absorbed in it that there was no way of being aware, if that makes sense.
Right.
So, and then I went off on this tube train, and I was having this fantasy, imagined scenario of terrorists on the train, and like they were doing stuff, and I ended up fighting them, having knife fights, and like killing the terrorists. But then I end up having to get captured and going through the illegal system, and I have to go court case, and I have this imagined persecution where I'm being punished for it, and this could go on and on, like, you know, just a little daydream scenario, but it's all like the worst, most horrible things you could imagine, things you wouldn't want to happen. So in a sense, it's defending you, it's protecting you. And that's why I see INTJs often as being like disaster avoidance specialists, because they've already imagined the worst. Well, that part of them has. It's already fantasized the worst thing that could possibly happen. And that's one, you know, where I hate being on top of a tall building, or I hate even being near like sharp things that I could stab myself on, because I've already in my mind run through the scenario. Like it's like the film strip of me falling off the building or stabbing myself with this thing.
That's so interesting. Anyone who knows me would also laugh, because I do that all the time as well. Like there's this really harmless ride in Disney World I got on one time, and I just smelled the slight scent of, like, it almost smelled like gas or something like that. And I was like, sitting there just imagining this fire breaking out in this ride, and like not being able to get out. The doors are locked, breaking down all these audio animatronic figures and throwing them to try to like break holes through the walls, and like just random stuff like that goes through my head. And I get really like absorbed in imagining these terrible situations in this setting where no one would possibly, like, people don't think about stuff like that. I mean, a lot of people don't. And so I can very much relate to that, that kind of like multiplying all these really extremely negative possibilities in my mind. So it's funny to hear that from somebody else, because I totally do that. And then like kind of try to prepare contingency plans so those kinds of things don't happen if it's possible.
Yeah,
go ahead.
That's one aspect, you know, and I think if you let's look at other like it's a judging function. So if you look at like INFP as a type, for instance, if they're like leading with like the heroic introverted feeling, then you've got this extroverted feeling opposing personality. And you know, it's funny, but like, you know, remember, like especially often it's funny, like I met quite a few INFPs who are like older people, and they're really lonely and they want to be with other people, but yet this kind of like passive aggressive sort of extroverted feeling is actually making decisions unknown to them, like pushing people away, like, and giving off extroverted feeling type nonverbal signals that are actually not appearing warm, that are actually appearing somewhat like stand off and kind of get away from me, that kind of like vibe. That's kind of part of that opposing, it's well named, like opposing personality, you know, it opposes, it's like that pushing you away, like yeah, get away, whatever. And it's like that you know, without realizing it, that part in their life, that function, extroverted feeling, which is so important to all of us to connect with other human beings, is kind of working in a shadowy way to actually push people away.
That's so interesting, because I have seen that a lot with IFPs, where like they really want close friends, and it's like they don't necessarily even realize that shadow is working against them, or how it appears from the outside. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that with both real life INFPs and even fictional INFPs. Like I use the example of from the movie Meet the Robinsons. I believe that the villain in there, he was an INFP, and he was telling a flashback. And in this flashback, it showed him like walking through the hallway, and everyone was like, "Hey Goob, how are you doing? Hey Goob, you want to come over? Hey Goob, it's nice to see you." And then as he was narrating his flashback, he said, "They all hated me." And it's like, what? But yeah, and then I remember like coaching an INFP who she was talking about how she didn't have friends and she wanted to like have like more friends and stuff like that. And then about 2 weeks later, when she met back with me, then she said, Denzel, I actually realized that I do have a good amount of friends. Like they actually invite me to like parties and stuff like that and like get-togethers after class all the time. I'm just the one who always says no, thank you.
Yeah, interesting. Like, no, just without unconsciously pushing people away, even though they desperately want to be connected to people. It's quite sad, and that's kind of opposing personality. And I don't know what your for you guys are different functions, right? You're talking,
right? Yeah. I was gonna say we all have that version of that, I'm sure.
Yeah. So Susan, for you, if in your actual type that you've come to know now, would your opposing one be introverted thinking?
No, the opposing one for me would also be extroverted intuition. And so, yeah, I relate a lot to what you were saying earlier about like multiplying negative possibilities. And I think it's really interesting, just the examples that you've given, because they do get in the way of what the ego wants. If you are an INJ, you want certainty about what's going to happen and a sense of like, if we're looking at charting the course, like Linda Behrens calls it, knowing what's going to happen, being prepared, and like having a sense of certainty. And the opposing role is kind of getting in the way of that by throwing all these negative possibilities that could happen. And IFPs want really meaningful, lives and things like that, but they also want meaningful relationships. But it's like extroverted feeling opposing is like not giving them what they want, but they maybe don't even know how. And I just think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. And I'm gonna have to go back now and think through all the types and ask people, where are you seeing this in your life as well? And then critical parent, that's one that, as a parent, and you're also a parent. So I have 5 kids. You have 2 kids, is that right?
Yeah.
Or you don't have to say also if it's, but you probably see that. I know for me, like I see the critical parent thing coming up more, as a parent. You see that auxiliary mother, father, nurturing role, but you can also see that critical parent side flaring up at times as well. Has that been have you noticed that as well as people get older and they start having kids, like that critical parent side can come up at times when it feels like your kids are like purposefully getting in the way of what your auxiliary function wants or what your extroverted thinking wants?
Yeah, I think it's hard being a parent, isn't it? And I'm aware you've got quite a few kids, so yeah, it's stressful, and stress, brings us closer to the grip, and these parts of us coming out. Here's a nice analogy that I thought of is actually like, the film Ghostbusters, actually very clever film, the original Ghostbusters film. When they open the gates to the dark side, the marshmallow guy comes out, right? If you remember that film, this giant marshmallow man comes out and starts stomping all over New York. That's a bit like the inferior function and getting out of the grip. But then all these other little slimy ghosts and things come with it. They all come through the portal, and I see it a bit like that. When you get really stressed, you might flip out and crush the city, and then all these other little slimy guys, all the shadow stuff might come out with it as well. So you might start like kind of then crossing over, getting gripped by these other parts. And the critical parents particularly mean, as a mean character, like it really is. When you see people in that part of themselves, it's quite scary sometimes. It's pretty aggressive. It's very directly conflicting and fighting and aggressive, and so dominating that it will, people will just put you completely in your place. And it's very powerful. I mean, it's a defense for us. If we've evolved with this center that has that nature, then there's a time and a place for using it. When we need to completely assert our boundaries.
Yeah.
But I think for my one in function in that position is the introverted thinking. And that's quite a hard function at the best of times. even as a heroic function, it can be quite blunt, quite critical, quite critiquing. But when it's in the position of critical parent, it's like it's like a vicious dog. It really does like want to rip people apart. And these triggers, these things get triggered by the aspects of the function that they're bound to. So, for introvert thinking, it's going to be stuff like the specificity of language. Like if people are using ambiguous or incorrect words and terms to define things, it's like that immediately gets you angry and gets you going. It's like, hey, I'm going to go and sort you out and tell you what you're doing wrong.
Definitely.
Yeah. Has that been has that been as an example from even maybe your own life? Like,
yeah,
it's like you're frustrated, the stress has built, that big marshmallow character has come out, and then you're like, and now I'm going to take down your argument because you're using like the wrong word, and maybe there's a logical fallacy in there as well, and it's just like completely decimating someone's perspective or point of view on something. Yeah.
It's like, you said that means that's completely wrong. That's categorically incorrect, and therefore you're stupid. You're an idiot. You don't know what you're talking about. That's basically the hard line of the. And I've got to be careful, because if I get taken away by that, and I don't want to get into some kind of long argument on social media, I've got to be really careful not to fall into it. And so I've decided, mostly not to get into debates on social media.
Oh, they're the worst. I would actually love to have a conversation with you about that sometime, but maybe not right now, but I would love to, because I mean, especially introverted thinking, I see that showing up in all different positions, shadow, on social media, because someone will be trying to get a point across, and it's like, well, I'm going to take down this one little section and, jump on this one word and things like that. And then the whole argument, they feel like the entire argument has been obliterated, but it's didn't really work. So yeah, it's interesting. And also introverted feeling kind of, or extra, well, oh my goodness, so many feeling negative, like shadowy feeling things going on social media as well, condemning people. And so I know, like critical parent introverted feeling can be very condemning, very like value judging, like, you are wrong, and you how do you sleep at night? Do better, and things like that. All those like really like condescending value judgments that people make on people on social media. I definitely can see a lot of like critical parent introverted feeling there as well. I do know that it's like it's like 10:30 in UK right now. So just quickly, like, if I don't want to rush you either, but have you noticed anything about Trickster? Like, we're talking about social media. Yeah. Like, what have you noticed? Have you noticed anything interesting about the Trickster function? And according to BB, that's the one that kind of catches people in double binds, like damned if you do and damned if you don't situations. You use it to kind of react to people or get back at them and get them stuck where they don't feel like they can win. It's like a lose-lose situation. Is there anything interesting you have noticed about that particular function, either like in your own experiences or on social media even?
And I'm going to have to bow out now, drive my wife to the gig, but it was nice meeting you, Richard, and I'm excited to watch the remainder of this.
Yeah, take care. Have a good day. Cheers.
Thank you, Denzel.
Bye.
All right. So, and also let me know if you need to get going as well, because I know it's very late.
If you want to extend and talk about the last two, and I'm happy to stay. So that's fine by me. But if you want to keep it to a sensible length, then I'm also happy to just cover a few minutes.
So for everyone who's watching, I gave Richard the wrong time to be on tonight. I said 8:30 UK time because I had miscalculated the time difference between where I am in Mississippi and UK. So it's very late where he is. And I'm, absolutely want to respect how late it is, especially because I know as a fellow parent, you've got children and who knows if you're up in the night and things like that. So I would love to talk about the last two functions, but we can keep it kind of, in a nutshell or whatever. But yeah, what have you noticed, or what's something you've seen with the trickster function?
Yeah, the trickster really trips us up, like in the aspect that it's carrying, or it's bound to. I think it's really hard to win. So we become in a double bind. We can't win. We're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't. It really is. So for me, like extroverted feeling, it was particularly hard. Like when I was younger, trying to like want and crave relationships, but not seeming to be able to get them and create them in the way that I needed to. Because again, that the good use of that function is really essential to being a warm and likable human being. To actually. But it's more to it than that as well. It's not just about being nice. It's about fitting in with social conventions as well. I think that's a really key part of extroverted feeling. And the trickster. One part of the trickster is that it kind of sticks its finger up, like it sticks its nose up at the principles of the function that it's carrying. So with extroverted feeling, I was always just like, screw you, social conventions. Like, who cares what arbitrary things people should think should be done? Like it's stupid, it's ridiculous. You make it out to be foolish, but actually in reality you're the one being the fool. You're being fooled by this trickstery center of yourself,
because deep down you actually do crave like to fit in or to find your group or your community, but you're like, I don't need you.
Yeah, exactly. It's the whole idea of doing those things that you need to create connection seem ridiculous and foolish and stupid, and they're like, why would anyone bother? And you just laugh at them and you mock them.
Yeah, I can relate to that. And I've also noticed, in relationships, this shows up a lot with how you interpret your partner, I think, as well. I'm in a relationship. So I landed on my best fit type being INTJ after many years of like really a lot of confusion. I'm not going to get all into that, but my husband is ESTP. And so he has child extroverted feeling, third place, and I have trickster extroverted feeling. And we did notice that there were like so many times that we misunderstood each other and completely misconstrued what the other partner was saying, because my way of seeing and interpreting extroverted feeling was in this kind of manipulative, this is silly way. And his way of interpreting introverted feeling, because that was his trickster function, was this is kind of silly and and so the shadow functions and exploring them, I think, can be very important for relationships, because it can help you to understand where are the categories that I'm most likely to misunderstand or project a negative intent onto my partner, my parents, my child, and how can I be conscious of this so that I pause and don't project that negative quality onto them. Have you noticed this also in your work, as in all the work that you do? Have you noticed that becoming conscious of this can help people to avoid these like really big, huge misconceptions that they can have with each other?
Yeah, because you do start to put a shadowy cast onto that function overall, which is one reason why you dismiss it and try to avoid integrating it in yourself, but also why you conflict with other people. So it's hugely like beneficial to people, especially in marriages or like close relationships or parent-child relationships, like anything where you're close enough so all this stuff is coming out and you are getting gripped and triggered by the other person and getting carried away, and you start to recognize these different states that they repeatedly go into. It gives you a map to help to name and understand them, and to not take it as personally, and to realize that extroverted feeling is not stupid. It's just like there's a center of myself that by its own nature is stupid, and therefore it's being bound to that. I am giving it that projection,
Yeah, I think when the trickster is just if you constantly see someone as being manipulative, or if you constantly see someone as like trying to why are they as immature even? Like, because the trickster is kind of has in some ways a childish energy similar to the child function, but it's more devious. So sometimes, at least in my experience, I've noticed like when I'm constantly seeing some behavior as childish, immature, manipulative, then I have to catch myself and be like, okay, wait a minute, is it really that way? Or is it just extroverted feeling and I'm interpreting it the way that it feels within me, And that's been really helpful. Just what you're talking about, like noticing these energies around, like what kind of energy does this function have? And how am I interpreting this person? Is it actually a fair, accurate interpretation, or am I projecting the shadowy nature onto it?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously what we want to work towards in relationships is withdrawing those projections, taking responsibility for that attribution for it as part of us and not part of them. But innately, these centers do react against when the functions, I think, are overdone or underdone, So if someone you overdid extroverted feeling, and you see people, everyone's got an aunt or somebody in their family who's really extroverted feeling and comes along at Christmas and is always a bit like, oh, hello, everybody. Oh, it's so lovely. And like, basically that triggers my trickster, because I'm like, immediately want to mock that because it's overdone. It's like that. It still wants to have the principles of extroverted feeling carried out. It's just it's trying to achieve it with like a stick rather than a carrot, if that makes sense. It's trying to come to the same conclusions of harmony in the world through through a more destructive means. So rather than moving towards, it's moving away from what you don't want. So the overuse or the underuse, the poor use. So again, you'll attack people who undervalue or badly use extroverted feeling, like introverted thinking types frequently. For instance, I often end up, basically, that because they're not being nice. I'll be like, hey, well, you know what? You could try being a nice person. You know what I mean? That's what my trickster wants to say to them, basically, if they're being that way. If they're neglecting their extroverted feeling, and I'm not saying all introverted thinking types do, but by the nature of that polarity, it's just common. So
that's really interesting. Yeah. And one thing that you brought up again is like there's this desire to mock people who overdo your trickster function. And I've seen that a lot as well. And I've noticed, like, okay, when do I feel, and I also asked other people this, like, when do you feel this compulsion to mock someone? Like, to be like, to almost say what they're saying, but in a mocking way. And I've seen it time and time again, people do it with their trickster function. And that's really interesting to me. Like, ETPs, I know, they mock introverted feeling types. They do the like fake oh, poor me and my problems, or things like that, where it's like looking at yourself and figuring out where do I feel this compulsion to just like put this certain type of person down. And I'm not saying that's like how you should figure out your personality type, like, oh, I don't know what personality type I am, well, who do I feel like mocking? That's probably my trickster function. But it is a good clue, I think, into understanding and identifying that trickster function. Lastly, the demon function is one I've had a harder time really like understanding. In all of the written text, in BB's work as well as Mark Hunziker's work, where I've really studied it, I feel like it's still very vague. And that was my, Denzel and I have done these sessions about the shadow functions, and our last one was demon. I haven't finished it yet because I'm like, I don't feel like I know enough about this in any kind of a concrete way where I could speak on this with any kind of authority yet. So I'm curious, like, what's your interpretation of the demon function?
Yeah, I do think it kind of demonizes us in our lives in a very sinister way that we're not really aware of. So for me, if my dominant function's introverted intuition, my daimonic function is introverted sensing, right? So for me, introverted sensing, I really put down to like explicit memory, to, you know, remembering, reliving, experiencing like past concrete stuff, you know, and referring back to that. And it's I think there's a natural tension, demonic tension between the functions. If you think about, like, introverted intuition is trying to dig into your implicit understanding of your entire life's experience and snap out a kind of synopsis of that, of the qualitative nature of something, and give you an insight into what it is. You know, it's this insight into the overall nature of something, and it comes as an insight. And then the reason that, like, introverted sensing is demonic to that inattention is that it like, as a form of perceptive evidence, it's such a different route. So if you have to try and then persuade somebody through an introverted sensing route of your insight, you've got to go completely back and try and reconstruct the entire thing and find the sources, the explicit sources, to support your insight, which wasn't achieved by an explicit route.
Yeah.
So it's incredibly demonic. It's incredibly demonizing to have this incredible, like, intuitive insight, but then, like, it's now worth nothing because you've got to go back and find some explicit, like, references that prove that insight.
So I'm actually very curious, and I want to make sure I'm actually understanding it properly, because this would explain something that's plagued me my entire life. So I love learning all this information about science and psychology. I love it. And I'll read these books and I'll read them over again. And I'll get these amazing insights. But then I cannot recall for the life of me, like, the actual facts that were written in the book. I can recall the insight and I can be like, wow, I learned so much. But then if someone were to ask me, you know, so lay out what you learned in any kind of sequential, you know, fact-based way, I'd be like, oh, it's just like all gone now. I can't hold on to it. The only way I figured out how to do it is that's why I write things down, because otherwise all the concrete, factual, historical, sequential information, references and things like that is just gone. It just disappears, like, really fast. And I may be misinterpreting what you said too, so tell me if I am, but it's like, is that kind of what you're saying to a degree?
Yeah. So the whole thing in life of having to refer back to concrete, explicit sources for information, it undermines, like Baby says, it's an undermining function. So it undermines the greatest gift of your dominant function. Mm-hmm. If you just take the dominant function at its face value, its insights are worth a huge amount. But from the perspective of introverted sensing, it's like, aha, but it's worth nothing because you don't have this explicit referencing route of information, past information, to get to the same point.
That's very interesting, and that explains a lot. Thank you for verbalizing that, because that makes sense of a lot of things for me. And for people watching, they might be going, well, I don't have, you know, demon introverted sensing, but this, I can imagine how this would show up in many other ways across all these different contexts. You know, if you have you know, just an example, say you had demon extroverted thinking, so you are a EFJ. I'm trying to think of a way that could show up, where you have, you know, you can't get the structure and organization around what you're trying to do. Like, you have maybe a great goal for people or something, and you can't you know, you can't have the extroverted thinking to back it up. I don't know, maybe you have an idea of how, like, demon.
So yeah, well, think about the tension between, if you've got a demonic, let's think. So if you've got demonic introverted thinking, so extroverted thinking, you're gonna have the hero that is going to be, it's going to be feeling, and it's going to be extroverted feeling, dominant.
Yeah,
that makes sense. Yeah. So think about the principles of it. So, you know, if you're trying to live a life that follows the social code and does things socially appropriately and keeps people happy, you know, that basically has a conflict with the principles of trying to just get things done for their own sake. Yeah. You know, or achieving tasks. there's always a tension between those two. So essentially, this is one of the biggest tensions in like the corporate world, for instance. If the extroverted thinking lead principle is like, do get stuff done, make loads of money, be really extroverted thinking about stuff, the tension that comes in the workplace all the time is like, yeah, but how do we be nice to people and take care of people and do things in a socially appropriate way? So they can become into tension because it can undermine fulfilling the principles of your dominant function. So in a sense, like the more you try to just go and get stuff done, the more you upset people. Essentially, that sort of thing. It becomes like the principles like that by which you're holding as your highest values suddenly become undermined or worthless because of this other set of values in that sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. I see that a lot. Because I've worked in, been in the business world for decades now. And even that was one of my realizations that, I'm not a FJ personality. I'm a TJ personality, because I was like, well, I really care about people, but I didn't care at all about the social protocol very much. And I also was like, let's get things done, and always an eye on the performance and resources and metrics and all these numbers and things. And if I had to slow down to really think about how I was impacting everyone socially, like especially in a work setting, I feel like, well, that's irrelevant. I'm at work. I don't really care how anyone feels here, because this is work. Like we leave that stuff at home. But then I've also, if we're talking about feeling judging types, and maybe there's a feeling judging type here, they don't necessarily just leave that at home. It's like, no, that's to the, if you have heroic extroverted feeling, then you're constantly going to be thinking about, well, how am I impacting people? What's the tone I'm setting? How are people connecting? What positive influence am I having? And, what is the social protocol here? And so to be in a work setting where the focus is very much on numbers and metrics and all these kinds of things, it could be very demoralizing to an extroverted feeling type. And so that would make sense. That would very greatly explain kind of the demonic, or if you're an IFJ, then maybe trickster extroverted thinking, like how the shadow extroverted thinking can show up and make you just feel like you can't win in that kind of a corporate setting sometimes. That's really interesting. Thank you for, explaining that, and that clears some things up for me as well, and maybe other people watching.
I've got one more aspect to that as well. Like, it's the dominant extroverted feeling type, the demonic extroverted thinking. So the other thing about extroverted thinking is like causality of like having taken an action to create an outcome. And that can be incredibly demonizing. So if it's like it's for an extroverted feeling type, having to accept that an action they have taken has caused consequences that upset somebody else, and therefore that might make them a bad person. That's about as demonic as it gets. Like if they've done something, and then that extroverted thinking causal chain of their actions that they did to make that happen essentially has hurt somebody, which is totally like distressing for their extroverted feeling, then it's really hard for them. That's incredibly demonizing for them to have to accept the consequences, the cause and effect of something they've done.
Yeah. And do you feel like when it comes to the shadow, at least this is my experience of what it's been, is it's harder for us to accept because it's, we don't associate it with ourselves. We don't associate it with our ego. So it's harder for us to accept that you did this. Like if someone comes to, a EFJ, for example, ESFJ or ENFJ, and says, you caused this emotional pain through this cause and effect, through some extroverted thinking means, maybe it would be difficult for them to be like, oh yeah, I can see how I did that. Because it's like, no, that's not part of me. I don't associate with that. That doesn't seem relatable to me. Like, that's not who I am as a person. And would you say then that, like, when it comes to the shadow, just in general, those are the parts of us that when people confront us with failures in that area, we're like, oh no, we get really defensive. Like, oh, that doesn't sound like me at all. I don't think I do that.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because I mean, we often do screw up, you know, and the Trickster's a classic one, because without function, we're always screwing up and looking like a fool, you know, the function in that area. And it's like, we think, haha, I've done this thing and it's great. And it's like, whack, 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 like that cartoon thing. And it just comes along. And you didn't at all. So, yeah, I mean, we get confronted and we defend ourselves against it, typically, you know.
Another thing that, okay, so it is getting very late where you are. I do want to, if anyone's watching here, if anyone's watching here and you have a question, go ahead and leave it in the comments, and I'd be happy to, relay that to Richard. Just let us know. I know another thing that's I've read about the shadow is that it's more flat when it's in use, and that was from Mark Hunziker's book on depth typology. He said when you're in the energy of your shadow, there's more of a flat, one-dimensional lack of nuance that you would normally have with your egosyntonic functions, and more because it doesn't have as much. They don't have as much support from your ego, so there's less of a. It's almost like and it doesn't feel like you. It feels almost more robotic or flat when you're in that space. What are your thoughts on that?
A flat, like it doesn't have the dynamics, or
it just doesn't have like the liveliness or nuance or richness of the like egosyntonic functions, because it doesn't have their support. So when you're in the energy of your shadow, it's more it doesn't feel as natural. It feels more like you're more robotic and flat, and without, like, more devoid of life. For example, when I try to do extroverted feeling, and this is something like everyone who knows me very well like makes fun of me for. It's like I'll be like with I love you so much, you're great too. Hey, like when people are doing like that kind of social stuff where they're getting into a vibe and they're like, hey friend, or things like that. I'm really bad at that, and when I try to do that, it's very robotic, and like I think this is what I'm supposed to do, but I'm not really sure. I'm wondering if you've noticed that kind of with the shadow functions.
Well, it's interesting that you make the distinction there between doing it or using it. So, I mean, the point is, I see the functions just as almost like a toolkit, right, of things that can be used, and then there's these centers, the centers that do the using. And so typically if we're intentionally trying to use, I'm saying like, go on, Susan, be very extroverted feeling, right? You make an intentional ego hero center choice to go and use that. But and that's different to the other centers erupting with that function of their own accord.
Right.
So you have to make that distinction, really, so, but yeah, our ego trying to use these other functions, which are usually bound more so to these other centers, does feel very awkward. And I guess you could describe that as being quite flat, in that it's quite usually not confident, quite difficult, and sometimes we might even try not to use it at all. So, but when it's erupting, I think it's usually quite crude, when it's erupting, all or nothing, like really, too much generally.
Yeah, like kind of what like the reactive, defensive, blustery part of it. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's like whether you're consciously trying to use it in a more normal state versus like the shadow acting out kind of in its own energy and own power. So that makes sense.
The function itself isn't shadowy. The functions are just tools. They're just functions, and it's the center that carries it that engages and uses that is. And then Beebe's model really is just saying that preferentially these 8 centers are bound to one particular of the 8 functions, which is what makes his stack of model of relations between them.
Yeah, that's a good differentiation. Thank you for clarifying that. We do have a question here from Brad. He says, an obvious question is, how can those shadow functions be developed? Though I've done enough reading about them to realize that perhaps the best we can do is build awareness and be open when they are activated. Would you say there's like a way to develop those functions, or is it more about like being conscious of them?
Well, again, there's a distinction between developing them in an intentional sense of using them with our ego center and becoming more skillful at doing them. That, and I guess life calls us to try and have to achieve that to a degree. The variety of activities that we do in a lifetime calls for us to monitor ourselves and make an effort to develop even the things that are not so natural to us. So that's one thing. How does it develop in a more systemic way? There's these ideas about them sort of integrating more over the whole course of a lifetime, almost the mind, the psyche, if you allow it to and support it, it will have its own integrative process. So that's a different process of, like, I guess Jungian analysis is one system that's designed to help facilitate that. It's not always done with a sort of typological model in mind. Beebe's one of the unique people who does that. But that's the point. And I guess a lot of Jungian analysts, not all, but will work with at least archetypes, and whether or not they're looking at functional aspects, they'll look at integrating the archetypal aspects. It's like, it's coming to terms with your own evil. How do you reconcile with that? And accept it and own it as part of yourself without really condoning evil, without being somebody that is evil. So it's like, really, there's some very big moral issues with the whole thing of the shadow and developing it. So that's one aspect. And then there's, like I said, the intentional tool like ego usage of all the functions that the shadow carries, and to do that again makes you have to basically stop withdrawing your projections, like stop seeing the function itself as bad or evil or negative or whatever, as destructive, because it's not. It's just the way that you've inherently tended to use it because of this arrangement that has made it come out that way. And you've got to remove that value from it to be able to more, like, to be open to using it.
Yeah, self-analyzing and thinking, let's look at the functions and how have I been interpreting them for so long. I'm 39 years old, and 39 years of interpreting a certain function as annoying or manipulative or destructive or negative in any way. It's really hard to break out of that. But looking at your own biases and really trying to figure out, like, where are my biases and how can I see these in a new light, as not bad, as just tools. Like you were saying, you clarified that they are tools. They're not inherently bad or good. You can have a knife that's used for carving chicken, and you can have a knife that's used for killing somebody. And the knife itself isn't bad. It's just how you use it. And that's how all the cognitive functions are. So figuring out, where your biases are, where your projections are, what kinds of things about people really annoy you and you don't know why. Well, maybe that's part of it. And then, practicing. There's a book I really like called Functions of Type by Margaret Hartzler. And it just gives like some examples of ways you can practice using the different functions. And I mean, for someone like, we can all practice, and some of us just have to, using the different functions. Imagine if we just decided, well, extroverted sensing's in my shadow, so I'm never going to use that. We wouldn't be able to get through our day at all, not being conscious of our surroundings and the details in our environment. So we do have to be, practicing, and just, times when you are not stressed out or overwhelmed, thinking to yourself, maybe if you're a TJ type, maybe I should write a little text to somebody saying, how are you doing today? Do these little things to practice extroverted feeling. We have another question here also.
Can I add one last point to that as well?
Yes, absolutely.
In terms of developing your shadow, in terms of perhaps defusing it a bit and making it less like explosive and problematic, that might mean going to psychotherapy. If these parts of yourself are carrying injuries and traumas, and they often do, because they're so, when we were as a child, when these parts of us come out and express themselves, they're often beaten back by the world or our parents or whatever, saying we're not like that, and sometimes in quite forceful ways. So if you're if that's the case, it certainly would be recommended to have support to actually try and reintegrate and diffuse these energies that are around it.
That's really important. Thank you, Richard, for bringing that up, because I know, like, in the type world, a lot of us try to, like, use type as like the catch-all for everything, and it's so important to actually get the help you need. And a lot of times that's type can be helpful, but it's not the answer.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And then we have a question this is the last question we're going to do because I know it's late there. Can you give an example of what a double-bind introverted intuition would look like for an ESTJ? And I know that's like on the spot, Richard, so you may not have an example like at the top of your head. I know I'm bad at coming up with examples like on the spot. But any ideas on what Trickster introverted intuition would look like?
Okay, so I mean, introverted intuition is it's the kind of most nebulous and mystical of functions in its own right, and the Trickster is the most slippery and nebulous of archetypes. So the two of them together creates a real box of confusion, basically. And if you think about what role does introverted intuition play, generally it's about grasping the implicit, getting this, seeing, like, realizing the unseen, getting the point or the meaning or the implications of something, or understanding the nature or essence of something or person or situation, from its nature, getting a sense of what it's like. Often we could just say it's like getting the point, and it's funny, as a dominant introverted intuitive, we often kind of take it for granted that we've got the point of something that maybe is not obvious to other people. And it might take a lot of explaining to help them to get there, but with a Trickster introverted intuition, it can go very deep. Like, kind of, I mean, you think about, like, limiting beliefs essentially are realizations about how the world is that are not really accurate. So I think that's one place where you might recognize it as an ESTJ. Like, what implicit understandings do you have about the nature of the world and how it works that could be quite pervasive and deep, so that you think they're real? And that's the point of it being trickstery. Like, these things will trip you up and make you look like a fool, and you'll be taking the world and interpreting things from this context, from this frame, from this belief about how the world is, which is actually off the mark, and it'll trip you up. So you don't even know how you got it wrong, unless you dig back and try and figure out what that implicit belief was, that realization that was probably unconscious, that you just took for granted.
Yeah. That's a really interesting, I think that would be a really accurate way of describing it. And yeah, I don't know if this is a good example or not, so you can throw it out. It's just on the top of my head. I've known several ESJs who have very dogmatic beliefs about particular like religious beliefs. And then if you get into questioning it too much, it's like if they're trying to go to introvert intuition to explain on this meta level the kind of the point of it all and the meaning and the underlying meaning of it, it gets really slippery, like you were saying, slippery really fast, and it sort of stops making sense. Whereas if they were to explain it from like an introverted sensing perspective, it would make more sense what they were trying to say. But if they start trying to explain their like a belief that they have, but in this kind of more meta introverted intuitive way, it can make it's like they get frustrated because it feels like they're not getting their point across the way they want to. It feels very like they feel kind of like they're not smart when they're explaining it in that way sometimes. Again, this is just off the top of my head. I didn't plan that, so maybe that's not a really great example of that. But
it's just
something I've seen. It's
looking out for things, where they're really adamant that this is how things are, but they've missed the mark. They've missed the point somehow. It's like there's their little intuitive snapshot of how of the world implicitly has it ends up making them look silly, for instance. That's that's how it would come across. And it's interesting as well how dark the Trickster can be. I mean, it's got a funny, silly side, like the clown and like cartoons and things, like the Roadrunner and stuff. But it's also got a like dark side. It's really well done in the modern like Joker film.
Okay, I haven't seen that one yet, but
like Joaquin Phoenix, I think he really, whatever he did to study that, he's really captured a lot of the real darkness of the Trickster. And it could torment us, if like shadowy introverted intuition could kind of have like a sense of like doom prophecy almost, like this is how things are, but it's really bad.
This is how things are going to be. You can't stop it.
Exactly. Living with this dark sort of spider web of like, I know like things are okay, but there's this thing about how the world is that's like just this dark shadow over me. And I've heard people describe introvert intuition in the shadow, other positions in the shadow a bit like that. This kind of like doom cloud.
Yeah, like a harbinger of doom. Everything's like a really intense belief in a prophecy that's maybe not very you wouldn't be able to test it very well. Well, listen, thank you so much. I know it's like 11 p.m. there, so I really want to let you get off so you can get some rest tonight and everything. But this has been really eye-opening, at least for me, and I'm sure for other people who have tuned in. How can people find out more about you, Richard, what you do? Do you have any like a way for people to find out more about your content?
Yeah. Well, it's funny, I'm not a great content creator. I keep changing my ideas and developing them, and they never feel finished. So like I don't like go put this big production out there. So there's various random videos out on YouTube that I've been part of. There's all of the type interviews that I've done on the BAPT YouTube channel as well. I've interviewed so many people in the type community over the years. There's personalityparts.com, my website, but I haven't really done that much with that for years since I had children. I do intend to get around to it. I'm a person who's just constantly waiting to produce their big work. And I guess that's often the story of introverted intuitives, that they're latecomers to this party. They kind of spend their life and maybe at the end create something good.
Well, you've already created so many. I mean, I've loved the information you've put out so far, and I'm going to link to some of that in the description under the video. So if you're watching this and, I'm not going to I have to go deal with my kids as soon as I get done here, but I'm going to tomorrow try to put some of Richard's links to his videos and his webpage on the description, because you really should watch his other content as well. It's really eye-opening. Richard, you have so much insight, you have so much intelligence to bring to this, and I love that you really back this up with, you love type, but also there's a whole all these other psychological fields that are important. It's not just type isn't the answer to everything, like you said today. Like sometimes there's other avenues you need to look at. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to be here. I thank you for staying up so late, and I really appreciate it. And I hope that you're able to get a good rest tonight.
It's been really, really great, interesting talking to you as ever, and thank you so much for hosting me. And I hope people enjoyed it, but we'll speak again soon, hopefully.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and we will be in touch. And thank you everyone who tuned in today. Really appreciate you also taking the time out, and we will see you again next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Okay.